You might have heard about the shocking application made a few days ago to the UK Home Secretary to have Hamas deprescribed as a terrorist organisation. If successful, this would mean that in the eyes of the law, the same organisation that murdered 1,200 people in Israel on October 7th, most of them civilian, that took 250 hostages, and that has been committing and admitting to terrorist attacks in Israel ever since they were founded in 1987, would no longer be deemed to be a terrorist organisation, which would also mean that supporting them, including with financial support, would be completely legal from the UK. Now, you might think that this unbelievable act of shock jockeying is in no need of rebuttal, but I feel the impetus to get involved. I know some of the people who are on the team making this application, like Franck Magennis, the barrister who's been instructed by Hamas to do so, and also I think some of the arguments that are being used are not unique in their attempts to obfuscate around the crimes of Hamas. Now, I know Frank has been complaining that the newsrooms have not been giving him space to actually talk about the application, which is why I'm sure he was pleased to have the chance to do so in his long-form interview a few days ago with Frank Barat. But I feel like I want to respond to some of the points that were made in this interview, because they went more or less completely unchallenged. So here's the first clip I wanted to show.
And so what the right-wing press seem to be doing around this, and what a lot of Zionists are doing, is using the atrocities that happened on October 7th, right? A lot of things happened on October 7th. Some legitimate military targets were attacked. That's clear, right? Palestinians have a right to use armed force. Some legitimate military targets were attacked. Some of the atrocities were committed by the Israeli forces themselves, enacting their notorious Hannibal doctrine. But that's in no way supposed to diminish the fact that clearly crimes were committed. Some of the crimes seem to have been committed by members of the organization I represent, by Hamas members. And Hamas's position is articulated very, very clearly in this application. They say we have command and control, we have rules of engagement, we observe the laws of war, and we reserve the laws of Islamic jurisprudence. And when our members breach those laws, we are committed to holding them accountable, because they say that they are a legitimate military organization fighting a national liberation struggle. So they say, insofar as atrocities were committed on that day, we want to be held accountable. And as I've said to other people in the press, it's clear that it's Israel who's not serious about accountability. They don't care about accountability at all. And Hamas has made it explicit they do.
Hey, sorry to cut you off just for a sec, but it's very important to mention that Hamas from the start have said that they were open to an independent investigation on October the 7th, right?
Exactly.
Israel has always refused an independent investigation on October 7th. And sorry to cut you off.
No, not at all. I'm talking quite a lot, and it's better for it to be dialogue, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. I think that to make the broader point, which is made in the application, like we take this broad historical approach as part of the factual background and part of the argumentation, right? Like, can't understand this without understanding that the history of the Zionist colonization of Palestine is more than 100 years old, right? And so I'm making a much broader point here, but you're basically saying Hamas is not afraid of an inquiry. Hamas says, right, fine, yes, let's have a full, proper investigation and let's see what actually happened, because they can see that whenever you shed light on the facts of what's actually happening in Palestine, Zionist credibility starts to crumble. It's Zionism, and this is a point we make in the application, Zionism has always been premised on the most staggering lies about Palestinians and about what's actually happening, right? Not least the central lie, the central sort of, talk about this biblical metaphor of the building your house on the sand or building it on the rocks. Zionism is built on sand. It's built on the malicious falsehood that Palestinians don't exist, or that they somehow don't exist as a civilized people because they're not European enough to justify being recognized as fully human. So Zionism has always been premised on the most racist lies, and it's predictable then that that when it comes to something like October 7th, what we have on the anti-Zionist side, and what my client says, is we're committed to the truth. We do not shy away from accountability. We take the laws of war seriously, and we take holding our own members accountable for things they've said and done seriously. That includes anti-Semitism, and it includes allegations of atrocities and war crimes and all the rest of it.
The thing about Hamas is they tend to actually just do what they say they're going to do. They tend to tell us who they are. Now, Frank likes to say a lot, just read the application so you can actually engage with the brilliant substance of it, made with input from 20 experts. Well, I have looked into the almost incoherent, rambling application, and amongst it is a dossier by expert Dr. Musa Abu Marzouk, who's a senior leader in the political wing of Hamas. And you don't actually need to look far beyond this application to see the intentions of those who planned the October 7th attacks. On the 7th, and in the days following the launching of Operation Tufan al-Aqsa, which is their term for the atrocities of October 7th, Qassam military media would release videos of 11 separate operations: Reim military base, Ain Habshur, an armoured support site belonging to Qisum Battalion east of Khan Yunis, Nahaloz, Amitai, Paga, Zikim, Erez, Bieri, Kfar Aza, and Kerem Abu Salem. Those clips, in general, show the intended operation in practice. Commandos leave Gaza, they attack sites, and then they return to Gaza after taking prisoners. What's Kfar Aza, Frank? What's Nihaloz? What's Bieri? Are they military bases? Are they air bases? No, they're kibbutzim, civilian communities. And across the three of these, 250 civilians were killed, including 10% of the entire population of Bieri, and around 60 are taken hostage. In his excellent book on democracies and death cults, Douglas Murray talks about his interview with Nimrod Palmach, who fought to reclaim kibbutz Bieri from the terrorists. And he said that and this is an account that others have echoed as well, that on the bodies of terrorists, they found maps of the kibbutz and they found instructions telling them to kill civilians and to take them hostage. Also in the bundle is a memo from the Hamas Political Bureau from the year 2000, shortly before the Second Intifada erupted, where they explain that according to their rules, within one of their so-called military operations, civilians might be inadvertently hit, or they may be targeted, but only in retaliation for the enemy's targeting of Palestinian civilians. And that logic is repeated twice in another memo by the Hamas Political Bureau titled Hamas Struggle, which is also in the bundle. So here Hamas are admitting that they deliberately target civilians, and it makes it really unclear, what crimes that they think they should be held accountable for if only they were investigated. Hamas, in fact, regularly admits responsibility for terrorist attacks. They acknowledged responsibility for about half of the 500 deaths of Israeli civilians in the Second Intifada. The trials of anyone responsible for those within Gaza, I think, are yet to be scheduled by Hamas. And they also regularly fire rockets into Israeli civilian areas. So this notion that they're currently there lining up like the redcoats, firing volleys into the enemy soldiers and wanting to obey the rules of war and Islamic jurisprudence is honestly complete nonsense. And there are, in fact, according to Islamic jurisprudence, there are multiple hadiths, as far as I understand, which have a specific prescription of killing women, children, the aged, and the infirmed for any reason. I don't think there's been a single documented case of Hamas prosecuting one of its people for mistreating an Israeli. And that's something that Israel, by contrast, has shown itself quite willing to do for members of the IDF. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of people in Hamas who are actually quite offended by this notion that, by this dismissal of all their hard work to strike fear into the heart of Israeli civilians and make sure that they don't feel safe, to then hear basically that civilians have nothing to fear from Hamas. It's complete nonsense. And you only have to look at the painstakingly researched and referenced 280-page report from Human Rights Watch about October 7th to see that they, as a matter of policy and strategy, had every intention of harming Israeli civilians that day. Okay, let's watch another clip.
That's different from morally judging someone from using armed force, and this is something we address in the application, right? Like, people have a right under international law to use armed struggle, armed force, to resist illegal occupation. There's no basis for doubting that it's illegal. We've known that since 2004 ICJ Wall opinion, and it's been reiterated in the 2024 ICJ's advisory opinion. So Palestinians are occupied, they're allowed to fight their occupiers. So people may disagree strategically and enter into a dialogue with Palestinians about that, but it's not their place to lecture Palestinians on whether or not to use armed struggle, because there are so many historical examples of colonized peoples, Algeria, you think about Vietnam as well, and the US, French and US interventions there, the north of Ireland, the south of Ireland. There are so many examples of struggles that have chosen armed struggle and have succeeded in ejecting a colonizer. So fine, you can have a strategic dialogue, but what you can't do is misstate international law and then start moralizing at Palestinians, because some of them, including my client, have chosen a strategy that revolves around, or at least includes, armed struggle.
So here it's argued that Hamas, they just want to use their legal right to resist in accordance with international law. Well, first of all, of course, you're not allowed to kill and kidnap civilians under international law, and I put it to you that Hamas doesn't care about international law. But second of all, have you ever noticed how people only use international law when they think they can try and use it against Israel? The international community, by and large, does recognize Israel's right to exist and its sovereignty, and the vast majority of the land is not defined as disputed or occupied territory. However, if you look at the Hamas Charter, the wonderful 2017 Hamas Charter that this interview applauds so much, that defines Palestine as the whole land, Palestinians as Arabs who were born in Palestine before 1947, or those born to an Arab Palestinian father after 1947. It rejects any alternative to the full liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea, and permits its followers to use any means and any methods to achieve that goal. Now, that includes land that was owned by Jews for more than a century, during the time, for example, of the Ottoman Empire and before Israel was founded. Here's an image of the founding of the city of Tel Aviv in 1909. Another point that's made is an attempt to equate Hamas with fighters from other conflicts like Algeria and Vietnam, and the application itself also makes reference to Nelson Mandela and the ANC in South Africa. I think this is a false comparison for many reasons. Just two of them are: one, there's no evidence to suggest that these groups use some of the particularly egregious methods of Hamas, such as the widespread use of rape that we saw on October 7th. And frankly, I think it's ridiculous that you can do whatever you want. There's an implication that there are no moral absolutes as long as you're oppressed, which I don't agree with. And this idea that you can commit those atrocities, and if anyone calls you a terrorist, you're Nelson Mandela, is frankly ridiculous. And second of all, I don't think any of these groups showed the sheer amount of disdain for their own civilians, their own people, that Hamas are showing. They don't care about the loss of life in Gaza. One, they shoot protesters when they protest against them, and they shoot people for trying to leave areas that are being evacuated. And two, they actually say that it's a good thing for their civilians to die because it helps their political cause. I'm about to show you a clip from the recently deceased leader of the political wing of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, where he actually calls for the death of more of his own people.
كما قلت وفي كل مرة أكرر إن دماء الأطفال والنساء والشيوخ لا أقول تستصرخكم، بل نحن الذين نحتاج هذه الدماء لكي توقظ فينا روح الثورة، لكي توقظ فينا العناد، لكي توقظ فينا التحدي والسير إلى الأمام.
Okay, so there are two other arguments I wanted to address that are made in the application. How will we have peace talks if we define Hamas as terrorists? And also, isn't it anti-democratic to do so? Well, first of all, and I can't believe I'm having to explain this, Hamas do not want peace. They don't want it. What they want is the complete destruction of Israel. And I refer you back to even the 2017 Hamas Charter there, but also to the memo from the year 2000 included within the bundle, where they say it would be futile to try to make peace or reach a settlement with Israel. So I really wouldn't be misled by the fact that Hamas have agreed to temporary ceasefires with Israel via Qatar over the course of this war. They've done that in order to lick their wounds and to get ready to fight another day, but peace has never been one of their long-term objectives. Also, we prescribe groups to incentivize and empower the moderate voices who disavow violence and who do want to make a peace deal. So Franck uses the example of the IRA without mentioning it was only once they agreed to cease violence that the British government entered talks with Sinn Féin. And, we should really be doing the same. We should be calling for any group that wants to be deprescribed first to completely cease violence, rather than just deprescribing them now, kind of as a gift in the wake of one of the worst terrorist atrocities recent times have seen. Also, the mention of democracy is pretty insane. The idea that it's not Hamas, who violently cemented their power between 2006 and 2008 by killing around 400 members of Fatah, their opposition, have held no elections since then, and regularly shoot protesters, including earlier this month. They're not the ones who are stifling democracy in Gaza. Instead, it's Home Secretary Yvette Cooper who's stifling democracy by prescribing them as terrorists is, quite frankly, ludicrous. All right, here's the last clip.
But some of the reasons she cited, one is to do with anti-Semitism. This is addressed extensively. You may have seen from a talk show segment that I did with someone who, as I put to him, was a bit out of his depth. He started quoting the Hamas charter at me, which is fine. But as I pointed out to him, that charter is from 1988, right? We think about that. Hamas was founded in 1987. So it's just after Hamas has been founded. And it's a kind of very rough and ready document that does clearly contain some things that it shouldn't have contained, as far as most ordinary people, certainly in Europe, are concerned, right? Of course, there is a broader context to why an organization finding itself in the Gaza Strip, finding itself being racially dominated by an ethno-state that calls itself the Jewish state, might fall into some of the traps that Zionism has set. That's not to make some simplistic intervention into the question of anti-Semitism and Hamas. It's just to say there's a context here that most Zionists and most supporters of Israel deliberately strip away, right? But the 1988 Charter has been widely criticized. That's almost 40 years old, right? What are we, 2025? It's coming up on 40 years old. And what's clear is that Hamas have issued a far more up-to-date, far more mature exposition of their politics in the form of the 2017 Charter. And that's addressed extensively in the application. The 2017 Charter significantly undermines Priti Patel's claim that anti-Semitism provides a basis for adding someone to the list of prescribed organizations. And then the other.
So even more wild is this idea that Hamas are somehow trying to stamp out anti-Semitism within their ranks, as though they're sort of like a local branch of the Labour Party in the wake of the Corbyn scandal. The 1988 Hamas Charter that talks about slaughtering every last Jew was never actually revoked, and Hania, the political leader of Hamas, and other leaders continued to refer to it as a source of authority, and he did it all the way up until his very welcome end. The October 7th videos that I'm sure you've seen, when terrorists are calling their families or celebrating the massacres they're carrying out, talk about how many Jews they've killed, not how many Israelis they've killed. Hamas, by and large, talks about Jews and Jewish settlers, and there's even one instance within the bundle of talking about killing Jewish settlers. The other thing is, by and large, it was very common on the entering of the homes of Hamas members within Gaza during this war that soldiers would find copies of Mein Kampf, that you could very confidently expect to find that, or also copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This application is full of holes, it's somewhat obscene, and in my view, the only objectives of Hamas are to create a shock reaction, deny their crimes, and re-traumatize the victims of October 7th by claiming what happened to them either didn't happen, happened by accident, or was done by Israel. You can watch the interview in full at the link below. I've also linked to our debate at Durham University late last year, where we won the audience vote 92-59 on the motion that this House believes that the Palestinian leadership is the biggest barrier to peace. This was also covered in the Telegraph, as I've linked. To Franck and your wider team, I've made this offer before over a week ago, and I make it again now. If you have any issue with what I'm saying, you are welcome to set up an interview with me and to debate it. I don't think your interviews in the newsroom are going particularly well, but nonetheless, it's time that you locked horns with somebody who actually knows about this conflict, who's been to Israel many times, including in a time of war. And I think that's especially needed when this application is in such desperate need of being exposed. To everyone else watching, this is the first in a series of videos I intend to make about the Israel-Palestine conflict and the surrounding debate, and if you're interested to watch any of this content, please do subscribe.